Most people think the Titanic story ends when the ship disappears beneath the waves at 2:20 in the morning on April 15th, 1912. But here's the thing nobody talks about. For the 700 survivors floating in those tiny lifeboats, watching 1,500 people die in the freezing Atlantic, their nightmare was just beginning. What followed was years of legal battles, public humiliation, shattered careers, and a cover-up that protected the powerful while crushing the ordinary people who'd already lost everything. This is what really happened after Titanic sank. Quick thing, if these help you sleep, hit subscribe and drop where you're listening from in the comments. Always curious who's out there. Alright, so tonight we're going back to 1912, but before we go anywhere, get comfortable. I mean actually comfortable. Fix your pillows, pull that blanket up, because where we're going, you're going to want to be settled in. So picture this. It's somewhere around 4 in the morning on April 15th. You're crammed into a wooden lifeboat with maybe 30 other people. Some of them are crying. Some of them have stopped making any sound at all. The Atlantic Ocean is black as ink around you, and the air is so cold that your breath hangs in front of your face like little ghosts. An hour ago, you watched the largest ship in the world break in half and slide into the ocean. You heard the screams of 1,500 people hitting water that was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 Celsius. That's colder than your refrigerator. That's cold enough to kill a person in about 15 minutes. And now it's quiet. Too quiet. The screaming stopped maybe 20 minutes ago, and somehow that silence is worse. You keep staring at the spot where the ship used to be, half expecting to see lights, to see anything, but there's nothing, just black water stretching to the horizon in every direction. Your toes are numb. Your fingers stopped hurting about an hour ago, which isn't actually a good sign. Someone near the back of the boat is shaking so badly that the whole thing rocks, and all you can do is wait. Wait for dawn. Wait for rescue. Wait to find out if anyone you love is still alive. Now, among the 700 and something survivors scattered across those lifeboats and overturned collapsibles, there was a man named Bruce Ismay, and Bruce Ismay was about to become the most hated person in America. See, Bruce wasn't just any passenger. He was the chairman of the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, the company that had built the supposedly unsinkable ship and packed it full of people and sent it charging through an ice field at full speed. And Bruce Ismay had survived. That might not sound like a problem at first. I mean, surviving sounds like a good thing, right? But here's where it gets complicated. Over 1,500 people had died, including hundreds of women, including children. And yet the wealthy chairman who owned the ship had managed to find himself a seat in one of the lifeboats. The newspapers were going to have an absolute field day with that. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay in this moment a little longer. Let's stay with the survivors floating on that dark ocean, watching the sky slowly turn grey as dawn approached. At around 4 o'clock in the morning, someone spotted lights on the horizon. Low lights. Moving lights. A ship. It was the RMS Carpathia, a Cunard liner that had been steaming through the night at dangerous speeds, her captain pushing his engines to their absolute limits to reach the disaster site. Captain Arthur Rostron had gotten the distress call around midnight and had immediately ordered every possible ounce of speed from his ship. He'd posted extra lookouts, he'd prepared blankets and hot drinks, he'd turned his dining saloons into makeshift hospitals. And now, as the Carpathia pulled up to the first lifeboats, the survivors finally allowed themselves to believe they might actually live through this. Getting 700 traumatized people aboard a ship that wasn't designed to hold them took hours. The Carpathia's crew worked with desperate efficiency, hauling survivors up rope ladders and in slings, handing out blankets the moment they reached the deck. And what they found was bad. There were broken bones from people who'd fallen or been thrown as they boarded the lifeboats. There were fractures and bruises from the chaos of the evacuation. There were people who couldn't stop shaking, who couldn't speak, who just stared at nothing with hollow eyes. And then there was the frostbite. Some survivors had been partially submerged in that 28-degree water for hours. Frostbite had crept up their toes, their feet, their ankles. Skin that should have been pink was waxy and white. Fingers that should have bent sat rigid and unmoving. The Carpathia had 3 doctors aboard and they worked without rest, triaging patients in the dining saloons, treating the worst cases first, trying to save what limbs they could. One of the injured was a young man named Harold Bride. He was just 22 years old, and he'd been one of Titanic's wireless operators. Throughout the sinking, Harold and his colleague Jack Phillips had stayed at their station, tapping out distress signals into the night, trying to reach any ship that could help. They'd stayed until the water was literally flooding into the wireless room, until Captain Smith himself had told them to abandon their post. Jack Phillips didn't make it. Harold Bride did, barely. He'd clung to an overturned, collapsible lifeboat for hours, his feet submerged in the freezing water. By the time the Carpathia pulled him aboard, one foot was badly sprained and the other was black with frostbite. And yet, despite his injuries, despite the fact that he could barely stand, Harold Bride insisted on helping the Carpathia's wireless operator send messages from the survivors. For 3 days, as the ship steamed toward New York, Harold sat at that wireless set, with his bandaged feet dangling beneath him, tapping out message after message after message. Meanwhile, somewhere in the ship's interior, Bruce Ismay had locked himself away. When the Carpathia had picked him up, Ismay had been led to the cabin of the ship's doctor. He hadn't left since. He wasn't eating solid food. He wasn't sleeping. According to one account, he just sat there, staring at the wall, shaking. A 17-year-old survivor named Jack Thayer actually went to visit Ismay, trying to comfort him, which is remarkable when you consider that Jack had just lost his own father in the sinking. He later described finding Ismay staring straight ahead, shaking like a leaf. Even when Jack spoke to him, Ismay didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear him. The chairman of the White Star Line was, to put it simply, a broken man. But the world didn't know that yet. The world didn't know much of anything yet. News of the Titanic disaster was only beginning to filter through the telegraph wires, and it was a confused mess of contradictory reports. Some newspapers said the ship had survived and was being towed to Halifax. Some said all passengers were safe. Some got closer to the truth. In Washington, D.C., a senator from Michigan named William Alden Smith was sitting in his office, staring at the headlines spread across his desk. Smith had a personal connection to this disaster. 6 years earlier, he'd sailed across the Atlantic on a ship called the Baltic, and he'd actually met Captain Edward Smith, same Captain Smith who'd commanded Titanic. Senator Smith had joined the captain for dinner, gotten a tour of the ship, and come away thinking the man was the picture of the reliable old sea captain, steady, experienced, the kind of man who could weather any storm. And now that captain was dead. His ship was at the bottom of the ocean, and Senator Smith wanted to know why. He called the White House. He asked what action President Taft intended to take. The answer, nothing. The president was too consumed with grief over the loss of his close friend, Major Archibald Butt, who'd been aboard the Titanic. Senator Smith hung up the phone and started typing. By the next morning, he drafted a resolution calling for an official Senate inquiry into the disaster. The resolution passed with almost no opposition, and Smith was appointed chairman of the subcommittee that would conduct the investigation. But there was a problem. The survivors were on a ship that was almost to New York. The crew members who could explain what happened were British citizens who could leave American soil the moment they stepped off the Carpathia. If Smith wanted answers, he had to act fast, and that's when things got interesting. See, Smith's office had intercepted some telegrams sent under a clever code name, Yampsy, which, if you flip it around, spells Ismay backwards. Not exactly master-level spycraft, but okay. These telegrams were asking the White Star office to hold a ship called the Cedric so that Ismay and the surviving crew members could board it and return to England immediately, before any investigation, before any testimony, before anyone could ask any awkward questions. Smith was not about to let that happen. On the evening of April 18th, 1912, the Carpathia arrived at the port of New York. The scene at the docks was chaos. Over 30,000 people had gathered. Some were family members desperate for news. Some were reporters hungry for the story of the century. Some were just curious, drawn by the enormity of the disaster. 20 ambulances from Bellevue Hospital were parked near the pier, ready to transport the seriously injured. A ferryboat had been converted into a floating hospital. Volunteers from the Women's Relief Committee waited with food, clothing, and emergency funds. New York had prepared for the worst-case scenario. They'd prepared to receive over 2,000 injured people. Instead, only around 700 walked off that ship. Among those waiting at the dock were Senator Smith and his team. They had subpoenas, they had questions, and they were not going to let anyone leave until they got answers. Smith boarded the Carpathia before most of the survivors had even disembarked. He made his way through the ship until he found the cabin where Ismay had been hiding for 3 days. There was a handwritten sign on the door, "Please do not knock." Smith ignored it. He pushed open the door and found Philip Franklin, the Vice President of International Mercantile Marine, the company that owned White Star Line. Franklin tried to tell Smith that Ismay was too ill to receive visitors. Smith's response was basically, "I'll be the judge of that." 30 minutes later, Smith emerged from that cabin. The reporters who'd been waiting pounced on him immediately. What had happened? What had Ismay said? Smith told them that Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, would be appearing the very next morning at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel for questioning, along with all 4 of Titanic's surviving officers. The investigation was officially beginning. Now, while all of this was happening, while Senator Smith was serving subpoenas and the survivors were staggering off the Carpathia into the arms of their families or into the silence of nobody waiting, there were relief efforts being organized across the city. The Women's Relief Committee had been formed by some of New York's most prominent female figures, and they moved fast. Within days, they had a comprehensive plan for providing services to surviving passengers, especially the immigrants who'd travelled in third class. Because here's the thing about those third-class passengers. Many of them had lost literally everything. They'd been travelling to America to start new lives. They'd packed everything they owned into trunks and suitcases that were now sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic. They'd arrived in a foreign country with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Some of them didn't speak English. Some of them had lost husbands, sons, brothers. What were they supposed to do now? The relief efforts were remarkable. Strangers donated money, clothing, shelter. The Travelers' Aid Society and the Council of Jewish Women stationed themselves at the pier to guide survivors to safe lodging. Hotels offered free rooms, restaurants provided free meals. Back in England, the Lord Mayor of London created the Titanic Relief Fund that spring. It raised over £2 million for survivors and victims' families. In Southampton alone, 549 people had been lost. Nearly all of them were crew members who'd come from working-class families. Suddenly, hundreds of households had lost their breadwinners. Wives had become widows. Children had become fatherless. The Titanic Relief Fund operated for decades. It didn't finally close until 1959, when the children it had helped had grown to adulthood and could finally support themselves. But while strangers were opening their hearts and their wallets, the White Star Line was preparing for a fight. Because even though the ship was at the bottom of the ocean, even though 1,500 people were dead, even though families were shattered and survivors were traumatized, there was still a question of money. Lots of money. Survivors wanted compensation for what they'd lost. Families of victims wanted compensation for their loved ones. And the White Star Line wanted to pay as little as possible. The legal battle was about to begin. And that brings us to the next morning, April 19th, 1912. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. The doors opened at 9 a.m. and within 3 minutes the East Room was packed to the walls with reporters, photographers and spectators. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Everyone wanted to hear the truth about what had happened aboard the Titanic. An hour later, Senator William Alden Smith arrived. The first witness called to testify was Bruce Ismay, the man who'd hidden in the ship's doctor cabin for 3 days, the man who'd tried to flee the country before anyone could question him, the man who'd survived while 1,500 people had died. Now he was going to have to answer for it. And the cameras started flashing. The cameras were going wild, flashbulbs popping like little explosions across the room, reporters shouting over each other, and there, at the centre of it all, sat Bruce Ismay. He looked terrible. I mean, the man had barely eaten in 4 days. He'd been hiding in a cabin, staring at walls, shaking uncontrollably, and now he was sitting at a conference table in front of dozens of strangers who already thought he was a murderer. Senator Smith had to shout to get control of the room. Get those photographers out of here. And just like that, the flashbulbs stopped. The crowd went quiet, and the questioning began. Now, here's what you have to understand about Bruce Ismay. The newspapers had already decided he was the villain of this story. Before he'd even opened his mouth to testify, they'd given him nicknames. J. Brute Ismay, the coward of the Titanic. One paper suggested the White Star flag should be changed to a yellow liver. Yellow, like a coward. And the accusations were flying fast. People were saying Ismay had pressured Captain Smith to speed up the ship so they could arrive in New York a day early. They said he'd pushed his way onto a lifeboat while women and children were still waiting on deck. They said he was responsible for the whole disaster because he'd ordered the number of lifeboats reduced during construction. Some of this was true, some of it was exaggerated, and some of it was completely made up. But Ismay was going to have to answer for all of it. Smith started with the easy stuff, preliminary questions about the voyage, about Ismay's role on the ship, about what he'd seen that night. Ismay answered carefully, quietly. He looked like a man who knew his whole life was about to fall apart. And then Smith got to the question everyone wanted answered. What were the circumstances of your departure from the ship? Ismay took a breath. The boat was there. There was a certain number of men in the boat, and the officer called out asking if there were any more women. There was no response. There were no passengers left on the deck, and as the boat was in the act of being lowered away, I got into it. Smith pressed him. There were no passengers on the deck. No, sir. It was a simple answer. maybe too simple, because the truth was there were still over 1,000 people aboard that ship when Ismay climbed into his lifeboat. Most of them died, and here was the chairman of the company, alive and well, claiming he couldn't find any more women. The room buzzed with whispered comments. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. But Ismay wasn't done defending himself. Over the next few hours, he addressed the accusation that kept coming up, the speed. Had he pressured Captain Smith to go faster? Ismay was ready for this one. He said he'd never consulted with the captain about the movement of the ship. Never. The captain didn't consult him either. They'd only discussed one thing. They'd agreed not to arrive at the New York lightship before 5 in the morning on Wednesday. There was nothing to be gained, he said, by arriving any earlier. Smith asked if it was possible to reach New York at that time without pushing the engines to full capacity. "Oh, yes, sir," Ismay replied. There was nothing to be gained by arriving early. Now, here's where things get interesting, because Ismay might have been bending the truth a little. A passenger had overheard him and Captain Smith talking in the ship's reception room. They'd been discussing the ship's speed. Ismay had apparently noted that they were on track to beat the crossing time of Olympic Titanic's sister ship on her maiden voyage. Was that a gentle nudge to push the engines harder? Maybe, maybe not. The captain always had final say over speed and navigation. That was maritime law, even if the owner of the whole company was standing right next to him making suggestions. But the thing is, Captain Smith wasn't around to defend himself. Captain Smith was dead, and dead men can't testify, which meant Ismay could say pretty much whatever he wanted. By the time the first day of testimony ended, Ismay was exhausted, wrung out. He left the conference room and immediately started complaining to reporters about being detained in America against his will. He questioned whether the whole inquiry was even legal, and honestly, that was a tactical mistake, because now he didn't just look like a coward. He looked like a coward who was trying to weasel out of answering questions. The newspapers had a field day. Meanwhile, the next witness was being prepared, and this one was going to be just as dramatic. His name was Charles Lightoller, second officer of the Titanic, the highest-ranking crew member to survive, and he had quite a story to tell. Lightoller was 38 years old, and he'd already lived about 6 lifetimes worth of adventure before ever setting foot on Titanic. He'd been shipwrecked at 15, he'd nearly died of malaria in West Africa, he'd been a gold prospector in the Yukon, a cowboy in Alberta, a cattle wrangler on a ship crossing the Atlantic. The man had done everything. On the night of the sinking, Lightoller had been in charge of loading the lifeboats on the port side of the ship, and he'd made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. See, Captain Smith had ordered women and children first, but Lightoller interpreted that as women and children only. He wouldn't let any men onto his boats unless they were crew members needed to row, even if there were empty seats, even if there were no women around to fill them. One of the boats he lowered had space for 65 people. It left with maybe 40. Senator Smith wanted to know why. Lightoller's explanation was technical. He said he was worried the davits wouldn't hold the weight if the boats were fully loaded. A 70-foot drop with 65 people could be dangerous, so he planned to lower the boats partially full, then fill them up from the gangway doors on the lower decks. Makes sense, right? Except there was a problem. The gangway doors never opened. The men Lightoller had sent to open them were never seen again. The boats rowed away half empty, and hundreds of people died because there was no room for them. Smith's questioning of Lightoller went on for 2 full days, almost 2,000 questions. Lightoller later said he felt like a legal doormat by the time it was over. But Lightoller was what they call a company man. He played his cards close. He gave answers that were technically true but didn't volunteer anything extra. And when it came to protecting the White Star Line, he was loyal to the end. At one point, he was asked about the ship breaking in two. Multiple survivors had reported seeing the stern rise up into the air and then snap off from the bow. The sound, they said, was like nothing they'd ever heard. The Solicitor General asked Lightoller directly, "Did the ship break apart?" Lightoller didn't hesitate. "It is utterly untrue. The ship did not and could not have broken in two." He was completely wrong, by the way. We know now that the ship absolutely did break in two. The wreckage on the ocean floor proves it, but in 1912, Lightoller wasn't about to admit that the greatest ship ever built had snapped like a twig. That would be bad for business. While the officers were being grilled about navigation and lifeboat procedures, another story was unfolding, a story about a ship that could have saved everyone. Her name was the Californian. On the night of the sinking, the Californian had been stopped in the ice not far from Titanic's position. Her wireless operator had gone to bed around 11:30, and that's when things went wrong, because about 10 minutes after the wireless operator turned in for the night, Titanic hit the iceberg. Distress calls started going out, CQD, SOS, but the Californian never heard them. Her wireless was silent. Her operator was asleep. What the Californian did see, according to multiple crew members, were rockets. White rockets bursting in the sky maybe 5 miles away. The kind of rockets a ship fires when it's in distress. The officer on watch reported the rockets to his captain, a man named Stanley Lord, and Captain Lord's response was basically to do nothing. He assumed it was some kind of company signal. He went back to sleep. When Captain Lord was called to testify, he denied everything. Senator Smith asked him directly, "We know the Titanic sent up rockets for some considerable time. You do not know of any other steamer which on that night sent up rockets?" Lord said no, he didn't know of any other steamer. "Then doesn't it strike you now that the steamer you saw sending up rockets must have been the Titanic?" Lord's answer was simple, no. Smith was incredulous. The timing matched. The rockets matched. The position was close. What other ship could it possibly have been? But Lord stuck to his story. The ship he'd seen was too small. The rockets didn't look like distress signals. He couldn't have reached the Titanic in time anyway because of all the ice. The inquiry never bought it. Their final report would state that if the Californian had responded to those rockets, she might have saved many, if not all, of the lives that were lost. Captain Stanley Lord's reputation was destroyed. He spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name. He never succeeded. But he wasn't the only one whose life was ruined by the inquiry. There was also Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife Lucy. The Duff Gordons were wealthy, very wealthy. Sir Cosmo was a Scottish landowner, a fencer, an aristocrat. His wife Lucy was a famous fashion designer who dressed half the nobility in London. On the night of the sinking, they'd escaped in lifeboat number 1, an emergency cutter with space for 40 people. It left the ship with 12 people in a boat that could hold 40, while over 1,000 were left behind to die, and that wasn't even the worst part. After Titanic sank, the people in Lifeboat 1 could hear the screaming, hundreds of voices crying out in the darkness, splashing, dying. Someone suggested rowing back to help. The suggestion was rejected. According to later testimony, Sir Cosmo's main concern was that if they rowed back, the desperate swimmers would swamp their boat. They'd all drown together. Better to stay where they were. And then there was the money. At some point during that long, cold night, Sir Cosmo had promised each of the crew members in the boat £5, about £700 in today's money, each. He claimed it was to help them buy new kits. All their belongings had gone down with the ship, after all. Their pay had stopped the moment Titanic sank. They'd need money to get started again. But rumours spread fast, and by the time the inquiry rolled around, everyone was calling it a bribe, hush money, payment to keep the sailors from rowing back to save survivors. When Sir Cosmo took the stand, he was questioned relentlessly. Did he promise money to the crew? Yes. Did he think it was natural not to go back and save people who were drowning? That was a difficult question to answer. I think it was still natural, he finally said, but I concede that it would have been a very splendid thing if it could have been done, a very splendid thing to save drowning people instead of sitting in a half-empty boat listening to them die. The Duff Gordons were never formally charged with anything, but their reputation in London society was finished. For the rest of their lives they were known as the couple who'd bribed their way out of helping. Day after day, the testimony continued. Witnesses were called, questions were asked. The truth slowly emerged from the confusion and the grief and the finger-pointing. And through it all, Senator Smith pressed on, even when the British newspapers mocked him, even when they called him ignorant, incompetent, a fool who didn't know the difference between a watertight compartment and a passenger cabin. At one point, Smith asked Lightoller about the forward funnel collapsing during the sinking. What was this that fell? The forward funnel? Did it strike the boat? It missed the boat. Then what? Well, it fell on all the people that were alongside of the boat. Smith pushed further. Injure any of them seriously? Lightoller just shrugged. I could not say, sir. Kill anybody? I could not say, sir. The British press had a field day with this exchange. They called Smith Watertight Smith after he asked whether the watertight compartments could be used to shelter passengers. They wrote songs making fun of him. They offered him $50,000 to perform at the London Hippodrome on any subject he liked. But here's the thing they didn't understand. Senator Smith might not have been a sailor. He might have asked some dumb questions, but he was getting answers, real answers. For the first time, the world was learning what had actually happened aboard that ship, and that mattered. By the time the American inquiry wrapped up in late May, they'd collected over 1,100 pages of testimony. They'd interviewed 86 witnesses, and they'd reached some damning conclusions. The practice of speeding through ice fields was dangerous and had to stop. The ship hadn't carried enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. The crew hadn't been properly trained for emergencies. The Californian had failed to respond to distress signals, and Captain Smith, for all his experience, had made a grievous mistake. Senator Smith stood before the Senate and delivered his final report. In the construction of the Titanic, he said, no limit of cost circumscribed their endeavour, and when this vessel took its place at the head of the line, every modern improvement in shipbuilding was supposed to have been realised. He paused. So confident were they that both owner and builder were eager to go upon the trial trip. No sufficient tests were made of boilers or bulkheads or equipment. No life-saving devices were reviewed. Officers and crew were strangers to one another and to the passengers. Neither was familiar with the vessel or its tools. Another pause. No drill or station practice or helpful discipline disturbed the tranquility of that voyage, and when the crisis came, a state of absolute unpreparedness stupefied both passengers and crew, and in their despair the ship went down, carrying as needless a sacrifice of noble women and brave men as ever clustered about the judgment seat in any single moment of passing time. The American inquiry was over. But across the Atlantic, another investigation was just beginning, and this one was going to be very, very different. The British were not happy at all. Here they were, the greatest maritime nation on earth, the country that had ruled the waves for centuries, and some American politician from Michigan was dragging their citizens through the mud, detaining British subjects on foreign soil, asking stupid questions about watertight compartments, making a mockery of British seamanship in front of the whole world. Something had to be done. And so, even before the American inquiry had wrapped up, the British government announced they would be conducting their own investigation, a proper investigation, one led by people who actually knew something about ships. The man chosen to oversee it was John Bigham, Baron Mersey, Lord Mersey, as everyone called him. Mersey was an interesting choice. He was a lawyer, a Queen's Counsel, who tried his hand at politics before settling into a career presiding over various legal bodies. His father had been a wealthy merchant from Liverpool, and early in his career, Mersey had worked on shipping cases. He knew the industry. He understood how it worked, maybe a little too well. See, here's the thing about Lord Mersey. He'd been a guest at dinners hosted by shipbuilding companies. He'd rubbed shoulders with the senior leadership of Harland and Wolff, the company that built the Titanic. He'd even dined with Bruce Ismay himself on multiple occasions. At one dinner for the Chamber of Shipping a few years earlier, Mersey had proposed a toast. He'd said that everyone connected with the shipping industry had to make sure nothing was done by legislation or in other ways that would decrease the carrying power of this great country. Decrease the carrying power. In other words, don't let regulations hurt the shipping business. This was the man appointed to lead an independent tribunal into the Titanic disaster. When the Prime Minister was challenged in the House of Commons about whether Lord Mersey might be influenced by the Board of Trade, he bristled. It's an insult to Lord Mersey to suggest it. Maybe, but people were going to suggest it anyway. The inquiry opened on May 2nd, 1912 in a place called the London Scottish Drill Hall. It was a massive space chosen specifically because they expected huge crowds, and they got them. But there was a problem with the venue. Everything echoed, every word bounced off the walls and came back garbled. Half the spectators couldn't hear what was being said. Even Lord Mersey himself complained that the place was unsatisfactory. They didn't move to a different location until the second to last day of the hearings. By then, they'd been struggling with the acoustics for over a month. The Attorney General, Sir Rufus Isaacs, kicked things off by presenting a list of 26 questions the inquiry wanted to answer. They covered everything: the ship's safety equipment, the wireless capabilities, the design, the accessibility between decks, the evacuation procedures. If they could answer all 26 questions, they'd have a complete picture of what went wrong. At least, that was the idea. The first witnesses called weren't officers or company executives. They were ordinary sailors. Lookout Archie Jewell, who hadn't even been on watch when the ship hit the iceberg. Fireman George Beauchamp, leading stoker Frederick Barrett. Barrett's testimony was gripping. He'd been down in the boiler rooms when everything went wrong. He described the red light on the stoking indicator flashing, warning them to shut the dampers on the furnaces. Before they could even react, the ship shuddered, and then the water came. The Solicitor General asked where the water came from. Barrett didn't miss a beat. Out of the sea, I expect. Even in the middle of a tragedy, the British sense of humour was alive and well. Barrett described the water rushing in 2 feet above the deck plates almost immediately, the watertight doors slamming down, the chaos as men scrambled to escape compartments that were filling faster than anyone had anticipated. The inquiry was obsessed with understanding exactly how the water had entered the ship. Witness after witness was asked to describe where they'd seen flooding, at what time, how fast it was rising. They used an enormous half model of the Titanic, about the size of a small rowboat, to demonstrate the layout and trace the water's path through the hull. Lord Mersey and his assessors even took a field trip. They toured the Olympic Titanic's nearly identical sister ship to get a better sense of the layout. They examined the wireless equipment. They looked at the lifeboat davits. They walked the decks where the evacuation had taken place. In their minds, they were putting themselves right there on the night of the sinking. But when the officers finally arrived to testify, things got interesting. Charles Lightoller had already been through the American inquiry. He knew what to expect, but the British investigation was different, more formal, more technical, and in some ways more dangerous, because Lightoller was a company man, and the company was watching. His testimony stretched across 2 full days at the British inquiry as well. Over and over he was asked about his decisions that night. Why had he loaded the boats with so few people? Why had he refused to let men board even when there were empty seats? Lightoller stuck to his story. He'd been worried about the davits. He'd planned to fill the boats from the gangway doors. He didn't realise how bad things were until it was too late. But then came a question that cut to the heart of the matter. Lord Mersey himself leaned forward. "It appears to me that you would be very unlikely to order the forward gangway door to be opened. You might get the head so deep in the water that she might ship water through that gangway door." Lightoller had to admit it. "Of course, my lord. I did not take that into consideration at the time. There was not time to take all these particulars into mind. At this time, I did not think the ship was going down." There it was, the second officer of the Titanic, the man in charge of half the lifeboats, hadn't realised the ship was sinking until it was almost too late. And he wasn't alone. Almost none of the officers had grasped the severity of the situation. The ship was supposed to be unsinkable. The watertight compartments were supposed to keep her afloat. Nobody had planned for what would happen if the unthinkable actually happened. When Lightoller was asked again about the ship breaking in two, he doubled down on his denial. Multiple survivors had described seeing the stern rise up and snap off. They'd heard the groaning metal. They'd watched the lights flicker and die as the bow pulled away from the rest of the ship. But Lightoller wouldn't budge. "I should not think," he said, after once she had shown a tendency to break and was weakened, she would ever have the strength to write again. Lord Mersey gave him one more chance. "You do not give credit to those witnesses who say that the after part of the ship, having once been up in the air, righted itself? No, my lord, I do not. Lightoller was wrong. We know that now. The wreckage on the ocean floor sits in 2 pieces, bow and stern, about 2,000 feet apart. The ship absolutely broke in 2. But admitting that would have been admitting that the greatest ship ever built had failed catastrophically, and that wasn't something the British shipping industry wanted to hear. Bruce Ismay was called to testify again at the British inquiry, but this time the questioning was noticeably gentler. In America, Senator Smith had grilled him for hours about the speed of the ship, about whether he'd pressured the captain, about why he'd gotten into a lifeboat while so many others died. In Britain, the questions seemed almost designed to help him clear his name. Lord Mersey went out of his way to note that if Ismay had stayed aboard and died, it would only have added one more to the death toll. What good would that have done? It was a fair point, but it was also a kindness that few of the ordinary passengers and crew received. Because here's something that gets overlooked about the British inquiry. They questioned a lot of people. Officers, sailors, firemen, company executives, even a famous polar explorer named Ernest Shackleton, who talked about how to navigate safely through ice. But you know who they didn't question? A single third-class passenger. Not one. Over 500 people from third class had died. They'd been housed in the lowest decks, farthest from the lifeboats. Many of them didn't speak English. Many of them had no idea how to get to the boat deck when the evacuation started. They'd wandered through identical-looking corridors, desperately trying to find their way up while the water rose around them, and the British Inquiry couldn't be bothered to ask even one of them what had happened. Yet somehow, in their final report, they concluded that there was no structural reason that any class of passengers had less opportunity than another to reach the deck and the lifeboats. No structural reason, never mind that third class was housed hundreds of feet away from the boats. Never mind that they were stories below the boat deck. Never mind that the survival rate for third-class passengers was less than half that of first class. Apparently, according to the inquiry, everyone had an equal chance. If you believe that, I've got a ship to sell you, slightly used, some water damage. The inquiry dragged on for 36 days. That's twice as long as the American investigation. Whether that was thoroughness or just bureaucratic long-windedness is a matter of opinion. One of the most dramatic moments came when they questioned the lookouts. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee had been the men in the crow's nest when the iceberg was spotted. Fleet's testimony was haunting. He described seeing the berg dead ahead, a dark mass against the starry sky. He'd rung the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge immediately. What did you say? Iceberg right ahead. The officer on the bridge had thanked him. And then, for about 37 seconds, nothing happened. The ship kept steaming forward. Fleet watched the iceberg getting closer and closer. Then finally, the bow started to swing. The ship was turning, but it was too late. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side with a grinding shudder that woke passengers from their beds. Fleet was asked if binoculars would have helped him spot the berg sooner. Certainly, he said. So why didn't the lookouts have binoculars? This was where things got embarrassing for the White Star Line. There had been binoculars aboard. They'd been locked in a cabinet, and nobody could find the key. The key had apparently been with an officer named David Blair, who'd been removed from the crew at the last minute before the ship sailed. He'd taken the key with him by accident. Nobody had thought to get a replacement. So the lookouts on the biggest ship in the world, steaming through an ice field at night, were scanning the horizon with nothing but their bare eyes. Would binoculars have made a difference? Maybe, maybe not. The conditions that night were unusual. No wind, no waves, no moon. The water was so calm that there was no white foam breaking at the base of the icebergs to give them away. But still, the key was in someone's pocket back in Southampton, and 1,500 people were dead. As the weeks went on, the inquiry examined everything: the design of the ship, the strength of the hull, the height of the watertight bulkheads, the protocols for receiving ice warnings, the training of the crew. And slowly, a picture emerged, not of criminal negligence exactly, but of complacency, of an industry so confident in its own technology that it had stopped planning for disaster, of regulations that hadn't kept pace with the size of modern ships, of a culture where speed and schedule mattered more than caution. The Titanic had carried more lifeboats than regulations required, but regulations only required enough boats for about 1/3 of the people aboard. The rules had been written for ships half the size of Titanic, and nobody had bothered to update them. Why not? Because the Board of Trade, the government body responsible for maritime safety, was advised by representatives from the big shipping companies, and those representatives had a financial interest in not cluttering up their beautiful new ships with dozens and dozens of lifeboats. So the rules stayed the same, and the ships got bigger. And everyone assumed that modern technology had made disasters like this impossible, until it wasn't. One of the final witnesses was Alexander Carlyle, who'd been involved in designing Titanic before leaving the company. Lord Mersey asked him directly how many lifeboats he thought the ship should have carried. Carlyle didn't hesitate. 48 boats. 48, 3 times what the ship actually had, enough for everyone aboard, but the company had decided that was too many, too expensive, too cluttered. They'd settled on 20 boats instead. The inquiry was wrapping up. 36 days of testimony, over 25,000 questions asked, and now Lord Mersey had to write his report. What would he conclude? Who would he blame? The survivors and the families of the dead waited anxiously. They wanted justice. They wanted accountability. They wanted someone to admit that this disaster hadn't been an act of God. It had been a failure of human judgment. But this was the British inquiry, and the British shipping industry was watching, and Lord Mersey had once raised a toast to making sure nothing hurt the carrying power of this great country. Throughout the inquiry, one name kept coming up: Captain Edward Smith, the man who'd commanded Titanic, the man who'd received multiple ice warnings that day and kept his ship charging ahead at full speed, the man who'd gone down with his ship, leaving no testimony, no explanation, no defence. Multiple witnesses described seeing Captain Smith in the final moments. Some said he'd been on the bridge, calm and composed as the water rose around him. Some said he'd swum to a lifeboat, handed over a baby, and then swum away again. Some said he'd shot himself. The truth was, nobody really knew what happened to Captain Smith. He'd simply vanished into the chaos. But the inquiry had to decide whether he was to blame, and this was where things got complicated. Because Captain Smith had done exactly what other captains did. He'd maintained speed through an ice field on a clear night, trusting his lookouts to spot any danger in time. It was standard practice. It was what the shipping companies expected. It was what passengers wanted because it got them to their destinations faster. The only difference was that this time it hadn't worked. Ernest Shackleton, the polar explorer, had been asked about this. Would he slow down if he knew there was ice ahead? "I always did," Shackleton said, even on a ship that could only manage 6 knots at full speed. But ocean liners weren't expedition ships. They had schedules to keep, passengers to please, reputations to maintain, and so they raced through the darkness hoping for the best. The report would be delivered on July 3rd, 1912. And when it came, it would satisfy almost no one. July 3rd, 1912. The final report landed with a thud. Lord Mersey stood before the assembled crowd and delivered his conclusions. 26 questions had been asked. 26 answers had been provided. And now, the world would know who was responsible for the deaths of 1,500 people. Except, well, according to the report, nobody was really responsible. Oh sure, there were findings. The speed of the ship, around 22 knots when approaching the ice field, was excessive. At least 8 lifeboats had been lowered with room for more passengers. The Californian had failed to respond to distress signals, but when it came to assigning actual blame, the report got suddenly conveniently vague. Captain Smith, they concluded, had made a mistake, a very grievous mistake, but it wasn't negligence. He was just doing what other skilled captains would have done in the same situation. He was following standard practice. He wasn't trying to set any records or please anyone in particular. In these circumstances, Lord Mersey wrote, "I am not able to blame Captain Smith." Not able to blame him. The captain who received at least 8 ice warnings that day. The captain who didn't slow down. The captain who didn't post extra lookouts. The captain whose ship hit an iceberg and sank with enormous loss of life. Not to blame. Now compare that to what happened to a Captain Watkins about a decade earlier. Watkins had commanded a ship called the Paris. He'd made a small mathematical error while navigating, and his ship had run aground off the coast of Cornwall. Nobody died. The ship survived, but the inquiry found his error constituted negligence, and his career was over. Captain Smith kills 1,500 people, not his fault. Captain Watkins bumps a rock and everyone lives. Career destroyed. The difference, of course, was the ship. The Paris was old, unremarkable, nobody cared about it. The Titanic was the pride of British shipbuilding, the newest, biggest, most luxurious vessel afloat. If Captain Smith was negligent, then the whole system that trained him and employed him and told him to speed through ice fields was negligent. The shipping companies were negligent, the Board of Trade was negligent, and nobody wanted to admit that. The report did make some recommendations. Ships should carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. Watertight bulkheads should be built higher. Crews should practice more emergency drills. Wireless operators should be on duty around the clock. All sensible stuff. All things that should have been obvious before 1,500 people died. But here's the part that really stung. Remember how over 500 third-class passengers died? Remember how they were housed in the lowest decks, farthest from the lifeboats, with no clear path to safety? Remember how not a single one of them was asked to testify at the British inquiry? The final report addressed whether the ship's layout had disadvantaged them, and the conclusion was remarkable. There was, according to Lord Mersey, no structural reason that any class of passenger had less opportunity to reach the lifeboats than any other class. No structural reason the people packed into steerage, sleeping in bunks 6 decks below the boats, had exactly the same chance as the millionaires in their first-class suites on the upper decks. The survival numbers said otherwise. 62% of first-class passengers survived, 41% of second class, 25% of third class, but sure, no structural reason. Charles Lightoller, the loyal company man, would later write about the inquiry in his memoirs. He didn't mince words. A washing of dirty linen would help no one, he wrote. The Board of Trade had passed that ship as in all respects fit for the sea. Now the Board of Trade was holding an inquiry into the loss of that ship. He paused for effect, hence the whitewash brush. The British inquiry was over. The recommendations would eventually lead to real changes in maritime safety. But justice, accountability, the families of the dead got none of that. And speaking of the families, while all these inquiries were happening, another battle was brewing. A quieter one. Fought not in courtrooms packed with spectators, but in legal offices and through stacks of paperwork. The battle for compensation. See, when most people climbed into those lifeboats on the night of April 14th, they weren't thinking about their belongings. They weren't thinking about the jewellery they'd left in their cabins, the furs, the expensive dresses, the family heirlooms passed down through generations. They were thinking about survival. Most of them grabbed nothing. Some didn't even have time to put on proper clothes. They fled the sinking ship in their nightgowns, their pyjamas, their bare feet. And when Titanic went down, everything they owned went with it. Now, you might think that when a shipping company loses your ship and kills your family members, they'd be falling over themselves to make things right. You might think compensation would be automatic, generous, apologetic. You would be wrong. In October of 1912, just 6 months after the disaster, the White Star Line filed a petition in the Southern District of New York. They wanted to limit their liability. Limit it, as in cap the amount of money they'd have to pay. Their argument was based on an old law from 1851. The law said that in cases of unavoidable accidents, a shipping company was only liable for the total value of the passengers' fares, plus any cargo fees, plus any materials salvaged from the wreck. Do the math on that. Passenger fares came to about $85,000. Cargo was worth a couple thousand more, and the only thing salvaged from the Titanic, the lifeboats. Grand total liability under this law, $91,805. For 1,500 deaths. For hundreds of injuries. For millions of dollars in lost property. $91,000. Split among everyone. The White Star Line's lawyers argued that the collision was an inevitable accident. Nobody could have predicted it. Nobody could have prevented it. The company wasn't aware of any negligence by the captain or crew, so they shouldn't be held responsible. It was a bold strategy. Some might call it shameless, but it was legally sound, and White Star was going to fight hard to make it stick. Between October 1912 and January 1913, notices were placed in the New York Times. If you had a claim against the White Star Line, you had until April 15th, 1913 to file it. April 15th, the 1-year anniversary of the sinking. As if the survivors needed another reminder, and file they did. Hundreds of claims poured in from around the world. When the deadline passed, the total came to over $16 million. $16 million. In 1913 money, that's almost $500 million today, an absolutely staggering sum. The claims were divided into 4 categories: loss of life, loss of property, loss of life and property combined, and injuries. That last category, injuries, contained some of the most harrowing accounts of the disaster. There was Anna McGowan from Chicago. She'd been traveling back to America when the ship started sinking. She couldn't get onto a lifeboat in time, so she did the only thing she could do. She jumped. Imagine that for a second, standing on the deck of a sinking ship. The lifeboats are gone. The water is rising, and your only option is to leap into the freezing Atlantic and hope someone fishes you out before you die. Anna jumped. She survived, but she sustained permanent injuries from the fall, from the shock, and from the frostbite that followed. Her claim said she was unable to provide for herself anymore. Then there was Bertha Noon from Rhode Island. Bertha hadn't jumped. She'd been shoved onto a lifeboat during the evacuation, pushed so hard that she was injured in the process, and then she'd sat in that tiny boat for hours, exposed to the freezing cold, waiting for rescue. Her list of injuries was extensive, an injured back and spine that left her unable to wear corsets, which in 1912 was actually a serious problem. Women's fashion basically required corsets, severe nervous shock, a misplaced womb, recurring congestion in her head and chest that left her unconscious for days at a time. She asked for $25,000, that's over $700,000 in today's money. The property claims revealed just how stark the class differences aboard Titanic had been. Margaret Brown, one of the most famous survivors, filed a claim for over $27,000. She'd lost multiple furs, gowns, capes, dresses, a necklace worth $2,000 by itself.